morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim, as we continue our reading of Charles M. Sheldon's In His Steps, Chapter 8. Henry Maxwell finished reading and dropped the paper. "I must go and see Powers. This is the result of his promise." He rose, and as he was going out, his wife said, "Do you think, Henry, that Jesus would have done that?" Maxwell paused for a moment, then thoughtfully replied, "Yes, I think he would. At any rate, Powers has decided so, and each one of us who made the promise understands that he is not deciding Jesus' conduct for anyone but himself." "How about his family? How will Mrs. Powers and Cecilia be likely to take it?" "Very hard, I have no doubt. That will be Powers' cross in this matter. They will not understand his motive." Maxwell went out and walked over to the next block where the Powers lived. To his relief, Powers himself came to the door. The two men shook hands silently. They instantly understood each other without words. There had never before been such a bond of union between the minister and his parishioner. "What are you going to do?" Henry Maxwell asked after they had talked over the facts of the case. "You mean another position? I have no plans as yet. I can go back to my old work as a telegraph operator. My family will not suffer except in a social way." Powers spoke calmly but sadly. Henry Maxwell did not need to ask him how his wife and daughter felt. He knew well enough that the former superintendent had suffered most deeply at that point. "There is one matter I wish you would see to," said Powers after a while, "and that concerns the project I started for the workmen. So far as I know, the company will not object to that going on. Though lawless acts may be committed by official management itself, they still want to employ men who are temperate, honest, and Christian. So I have no doubt that my successor, Arnold Stone, will have the same courtesy shown him in the use of the room. You made a favorable impression on the men. Would you go down there as often as you can? And please get Arnold Stone interested in providing something for the furnishings and expense of the coffee maker and reading tables. Will you do it?" "Yes," replied Henry Maxwell. Before parting, Maxwell and Powers prayed together. The pastor of the First Church went home deeply stirred by the events of the week. Gradually the truth was growing on him that the pledge to do as Jesus would was working out a revolution in his parish and throughout the city. Every day added to the serious results of obedience to that pledge. Maxwell did not pretend to see the end. He was, in fact, only now at the very beginning of events that were destined to change the history of hundreds of families, not only in Raymond, but throughout the entire country. As he thought of Edward Norman and Rachel and Mr. Powers, and of the results that had already come from their actions, he could not help feeling an intense interest in the probable effect if all those persons in First Church who had made the pledge faithfully kept it. Would they all keep it? Would some of them turn back when the cross became too heavy? He was asking this question the next morning as he sat in his study, when the president of the Endeavor Society called to see him. "I suppose I ought not to trouble you with my case," said young Fred Morris, coming at once to the purpose of his visit. "But I thought, Mr. Maxwell, that you might advise me a little." "I'm glad you came. Go on, Fred." Henry Maxwell had known the young man since he first became the pastor at First Church, and loved and honored him for his consistent, faithful service in the church. "Well, the fact is, I'm out of a job. You know I've been doing reporting for the Morning Sentinel since I graduated last year. Well, last Sunday my boss asked me to take Sunday morning for digging up the details on that train robbery at the junction, and write the thing up for the extra edition that comes out on Monday. I refused to work on Sunday, and he gave me my dismissal. The boss was in a bad temper, or I think perhaps he would not have done it. He has always treated me well before. Now, do you think Jesus would have done what I did? I ask because the other fellows say I was a fool not to do the work. I want to feel that a Christian acts from motives that may seem strange to others sometimes, but not foolish. What do you think?" "I think you kept your promise, Fred. I cannot believe Jesus would do newspaper work on Sunday, as you were asked to do it." "Thank you, Mr. Maxwell. I feel a little troubled over it. The longer I think about it, the better I feel." As young Morris rose to leave, His pastor laid a loving hand on his shoulder. "What are you going to do now, Fred?" "I don't know yet. I have thought of going to Chicago or some other large city." "Why don't you try to get on here at the News?" "They're fully staffed, or so I've heard." Maxwell pondered for a moment. "Come down to the News office with me, and let's see Edward Norman." So a few minutes later, Edward Norman received into his office the minister and young Morris. Maxwell briefly stated the reason for their visit. "I can give you a place at the News," said Norman with a smile. "I want reporters who won't work on Sundays. And what is more, I'm making plans for a special kind of reporting which I believe you can help me develop." When Henry Maxwell began the 9-block walk back to his home, he was feeling that deep satisfaction which comes from being God's servant. Starting to pass Milton Wright's main store, he hesitated, then on impulse walked inside. The balding middle-aged merchant greeted him warmly. "Come into my office where we can talk," he urged. Once they were seated in Wright's comfortable private office, the businessman leaned forward intently. "Since making that commitment to follow Jesus, I have been compelled to change the entire operation of my company. During the last 20 years, I've done many things I know Jesus would not have done. Now I'm suddenly aware of many things that he would do in this business." "What was the first change you made?" asked Henry Maxwell. He felt suddenly that his sermon preparation could wait. "The first change I had to make was in my thinking about my employees. I came down here Monday morning after that Sunday, and I asked myself, what would Jesus do in his relationship to these clerks, bookkeepers, office boys, and salesmen? Would he try to establish some sort of personal relationship to them, different from that which I have sustained all these years? I soon answered the question with a yes. Then came the question, what was I to do? I did not see how I could answer it to my satisfaction without getting all of my employees together and having a talk with them. So we had a meeting out in the warehouse Tuesday night. A good many things came out of that meeting. I can't tell you all. I tried to talk to the men as I imagined Jesus might. It was hard work, for I have not been in the habit of it, and must have made mistakes. But I can hardly describe to you, Pastor, the effect of that meeting on some of the men. Before it closed, I saw more than a dozen of them with tears on their faces. I kept asking, what would Jesus do? And the more I asked it, the farther along I was pushed into personal dealings with the men who have worked for me all these years. Right now I am in the midst of reconstructing the entire business, insofar as all our personnel operations are concerned. I have not yet reached definite conclusions in regard to all the details. I am not sufficiently knowledgeable of Jesus' methods. But let me show you something. Wright reached into one of his desk drawers and took out a paper, which he handed to the pastor. I have sketched out what seems to me a plan such as Jesus might go by in a business like mine. I want you to tell me what you think of it. Written on the head of the paper, what would Jesus probably do in Milton Wright's place as a businessman? 1. He would engage in the business first of all for the purpose of glorifying God, and not for the primary purpose of making money. 2. All profit achieved he would not regard as his own, but as trust funds to be used for the good of humanity. 3. His relationships with all employees would be loving and helpful. He would think of them in the light of souls to be saved. This thought would always be of greater importance than making money. 4. He would never do a single dishonest or questionable act, or try in any way to take advantage of anyone else. 5. The principle of unselfishness and helpfulness in the business would direct all of its details. 6. Upon these principles, he would shape the entire plan of his relationships to his employees, to his customers, and to the general business world with which he was connected. Henry Maxwell read this over slowly. It reminded him of his own attempts the day before to put into a concrete form his ideas of Jesus' probable action. He was very thoughtful as he looked up and met Wright's eager gaze. Do you believe you can continue to make your business pay operating on these principles? I do. Intelligent unselfishness ought to be wiser than intelligent selfishness, don't you think? If my employees begin to have a personal share in the profits of the business, and, more than that, feel a personal love for themselves on the part of the management, won't the result be more care, less waste, more diligence, more faithfulness? Yes, I would certainly think so, yet a good many other businessmen wouldn't agree, would they? I mean as a general rule? How about your relations to people you deal with in the world who will consider your plan completely unbusinesslike? That complicates my actions, of course. Does your plan contemplate what is coming to be known as management-employee cooperation? Yes, it does, so far as I have gone. I am absolutely convinced that Jesus, in my place, would be absolutely unselfish. He would love all these men in his employ. He would consider the main purpose of all business to be a mutual helpfulness, and would conduct it all so that God's kingdom would be the first object sought. When Maxwell finally left, he was profoundly impressed with the revolution that was being wrought already in this business. There was no mistaking the fact that Milton Wright's new relationship with his employees was beginning, even after less than 2 weeks, to transform the atmosphere of the store. It was apparent even in the faces of the clerks. If he keeps on, he will be one of the most influential preachers in Raymond, said Henry Maxwell to himself as he reached his study. He wondered if Milton Wright would continue his plan if he began to lose money, as was possible. He prayed that the Holy Spirit, who had shown himself with growing power in the company of the first church disciples, would abide long with them all, and with that prayer on his lips, and in his heart, he began the preparation of his sermon for the coming Sunday. Saturday night at the Rectangle, there occurred some of the most remarkable scenes that Mr. Gray and his wife had ever witnessed. The meeting had intensified with each night of Rachel's singing. It cannot be said that up to that Saturday night there was any appreciable decrease in the heavy drinking, coarse language, and immorality throughout the area. The Rectangle had too much local pride in being tough. But in spite of itself, there was a gradual yielding to a new power that it had never quite before experienced. Mr. Gray had recovered his voice, so that by Saturday he was able to speak. The fact that he was obliged to use his voice carefully made it necessary for the people to be very quiet if they wanted to hear. Gradually they had come to understand during these many weeks that out of a perfectly unselfish love for them, this dedicated man was giving his time and strength to bring them knowledge of a Savior. Tonight the crowd was as quiet as Henry Maxwell's decorous audiences ever were. The fringe around the tent was deeper, and the saloons were practically empty. The evangelist felt that one of the great prayers of his life was going to be answered. And Rachel? Her singing seemed to Virginia Page and Jasper Chase to be more eloquent than ever. They had come together again tonight, this time with Dr. West, who had spent all his spare time that week in the Rectangle with some charity cases. Virginia was at the organ. Jasper sat on a front seat. After the message, the Rectangle seemed to sway as one man toward the platform when Rachel began to sing. Just as I am, without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me, and that thou bidst me come to thee, O Lamb of God, I come, I come. Gray hardly said a word. He stretched out his hand with a gesture of invitation, and down the 2 aisles of the tent, a line of men and women moved toward the front. One woman, out of the street, was near the organ. Virginia caught the look on her face, and for the first time in the life of this rich girl, the thought of what Jesus was to that sinful woman came with a suddenness and power that was like new birth. Virginia left the organ, went to her, looked into the woman's face, and caught both of her hands in her own. Clinging to Virginia, the woman fell on her knees, sobbing, her head resting upon the back of the rude bench in front of her. Virginia, after a moment's hesitation, knelt beside her, and the 2 heads were bowed close together. As the people crowded in a double row all about the platform, most of them kneeling and crying, a man in evening dress pushed through the seats and came and knelt with the others. By his side was the same drunken man who had disrupted the meeting with his singing the night Maxwell had spoken. The young man was kneeling within a few feet of Rachel Winslow, who was still singing softly. She turned for a moment and looked in his direction, and was amazed to see the face of Roland Page. For a moment her voice faltered, and then she went on. "Just as I am, thou wilt receive, wilt welcome, pardon, cleanse, relieve, because thy promise I believe. O Lamb of God, I come, I come." And that's the end of chapter 8. Next week we will continue reading chapter 9. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.